December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burned. The air was thick with smoke and disbelief. In just 2 hours, Japan had struck a crippling blow, sinking battleships, killing over 2,000 Americans, and humiliating a nation that thought itself untouchable. But amid the wreckage and the chaos, in a small, dimly lit basement under a nondescript building on the island of Oahu, a handful of men were already fighting back. Not with rifles or bombs, but with logic, patience, and sound. These were the codebreakers, mathematicians, linguists, and radio operators who intercepted Japan's secret communications. Their weapons were pencils, paper, and machines that clicked and whirred like mechanical hearts. Their mission, to understand an enemy who never spoke plainly. At the center of this quiet war was Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, a man who didn't look like a hero. He wore a bathrobe to work, chewed on cigars, and rarely smiled. But his mind, sharp, erratic, and relentless, was about to change the course of the Pacific War. Rochefort led Station Hypo, a secret code-breaking unit hidden beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters in Honolulu. The men there listened day and night, collecting streams of intercepted Japanese naval messages, all encrypted with a massive, ever-changing code known as JN-25. JN-25 was supposed to be unbreakable. It contained over 30,000 code groups, each representing a word, phrase, or number. Every few weeks, Japan changed both the vocabulary and the numerical cipher overlay, a nightmare for any cryptanalyst. But Rochefort refused to believe in unbreakable. The enemy always leaves a trace, he told his team. Our job is to find it. And so began a race, one fought not on the open seas but in silence, across radio waves and in the margins of notebooks filled with numbers that made no sense until they did. The Americans had already been intercepting Japanese naval traffic since the 1930s. Yet the Japanese were masters of discipline. Their operators never said a word too much. Messages were concise, sterile, almost robotic. Every bit of redundancy was stripped away, leaving only layers of encoded digits. But in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, something changed. The Imperial Navy began moving, fast, across the Pacific. The Americans knew nothing of where they would strike next. Every piece of intercepted chatter, every 5-digit code group, could be a clue. The work at Station Hypo became obsessive. Operators like Ralph Briggs and Wesley Dusty Keenan sat for endless hours with headphones pressed to their ears, listening to faint Morse signals from the farthest corners of the Pacific. Outside, the war was chaos. Inside Hypo, it was pure focus. Rochefort's team divided the code into fragments. They charted patterns, frequencies, repetitions, like archaeologists digging through layers of language. They began to notice recurring sequences, groups of numbers that might mean aircraft carrier, Midway, or Tokyo. Slowly, painfully, the unknowns turned into guesses, and guesses turned into knowledge. Still, the higher command in Washington doubted them. The Office of Naval Intelligence, especially a rival section known as OP-20G, considered Rochefort reckless, even arrogant. His reports, they said, were too speculative. But in early 1942, a message appeared that would test everything they had worked for. A coded instruction from Tokyo Naval Headquarters mentioned a planned Operation MI. The date, early June. The target, unknown. Rochefort believed MI meant Midway, a small atoll halfway between Hawaii and Japan. Washington wasn't convinced. They wanted proof. So Rochefort devised a trick. He asked the Midway base to send an unencrypted message reporting that their freshwater condenser had broken, that they were low on water. A day later, Hypo intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that AF is short of water. AF, the code name they'd been seeing for weeks, was confirmed. Midway was the target. It was the breakthrough of the century. In Washington, Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received Rochefort's report with quiet gravity. If Rochefort was right, and if the Americans could prepare in time, they might finally turn the tide. Nimitz had no illusions. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy still vastly outnumbered the Americans in ships, aircraft, and experience. Their carrier force, the Kido Butai, had crushed every foe it faced. But now, thanks to a man in a basement and his sleepless team of codebreakers, the United States had something far more powerful than battleships: foreknowledge. For the first time, America would know where the enemy would strike, and when. In the days that followed, the messages kept flowing. More fragments of JN-25 traffic confirmed the coming assault. Hypo tracked ship movements, weather reports, and logistics requests, all pointing to a major offensive in the Central Pacific. By May 1942, Rochefort's analysts could even estimate the Japanese order of battle: 4 carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a full invasion force. Rochefort passed everything to Nimitz. Nimitz believed him. Washington still didn't. The Navy's codebreakers in D.C. demanded more confirmation. Some even accused Rochefort of guessing. But Nimitz trusted results over bureaucracy. He ordered the fleet to prepare. The Americans would set a trap. June 4, 1942. The dawn over Midway was calm. Then the sky filled with Japanese planes. But below them, hidden beyond the horizon, 3 American carriers waited: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Every movement of the Japanese task force had been predicted, every vector plotted. The ambushers had become the ambushed. It was the moment when a single radio man's impossible code crack let America strike first. And in that instant, history shifted. The Pacific, June 1942. In every direction, the ocean stretched endless and silent. Yet beneath that surface, 2 fleets hunted one another in near-perfect secrecy. For Japan, Midway would complete a string of victories that had begun at Pearl Harbor. For the United States, it was a chance to prove that intelligence, not firepower, could decide a war. Inside the underground warren of Station Hypo, Commander Rochefort hadn't slept for nearly 3 days. His team had just finished reconstructing the latest version of the JN-25 codebook, using a patchwork of fragments captured months earlier. The Japanese had recently changed thousands of code groups, rendering older decrypts useless. But the Americans had a weapon the Japanese did not suspect: persistence. Hypo's analysts compared each intercepted 5-digit group against earlier versions. If 28491 had once meant aircraft carrier, and a similar pattern now appeared near messages discussing logistics or refueling, it suggested continuity. Linguists like Agnes Mayer Driscoll and Thomas Huckins cross-referenced kanji-based expressions with likely English equivalents. They built dictionaries in pencil, constantly revised, taped together with ration paper. Every message began with a header: frequency call signs, routing, date-time groups, clues to where a fleet was operating. The body, encrypted through additive tables, looked meaningless, but when enough repetitions appeared, patterns emerged. One analyst described it as listening to music through static. You learn the tune before you hear the words. By late May, Rochefort's people could read about 15% of any JN-25 message, enough to grasp intention. They saw references to striking force, advance force, and objective AF. Supply messages mentioned aviation fuel and carrier ordnance. Weather reports matched the coordinates northwest of Midway. Every fragment lined up like stars forming a constellation. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared the bait. He ordered Task Forces 16 and 17 under Admiral Spruance and Fletcher to take position northeast of Midway. "We will ambush the ambushers," Nimitz told his staff. His calm voice belied the gamble. If Rochefort was wrong, those carriers would be alone, deep in enemy waters. On June 3rd, American patrol planes sighted part of the Japanese invasion group. The signal flashed back to Pearl: enemy approaching from northwest. Rochefort's decoding room erupted. Their prediction was exact. Yet the main Japanese carrier force, under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, remained hidden somewhere beyond the horizon.
At 0430 hours on June 4th, radar operators on Midway detected incoming aircraft. The first wave of 108 Japanese bombers and fighters struck the island minutes later, shredding runways and fuel tanks. But the defenders held, and crucially, Midway's own scout planes spotted the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu roughly 180 miles out. Thanks to Rochefort's decrypts, Nimitz already knew the Japanese plan. Nagumo would launch one airstrike, assess damage, then rearm his planes for a second attack. That window, roughly 30 minutes, would be the Americans' only chance. While the battle raged overhead, the scene inside Hypo was eerily calm. Radio operators logged every intercepted burst from Japanese flagship frequencies. When Nagumo's staff reported first attack wave returning, Rochefort quietly marked the time on the wall chart. He turned to his team. They're about to rearm for surface bombardment. That insight, relayed through encrypted channels to Nimitz's task force, reached Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise at the perfect moment. Spruance launched every available aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, scouts, toward the coordinates decoded hours earlier. The first American attacks failed catastrophically.
The outdated Devastator torpedo bombers were slaughtered, their slow approach meeting walls of anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters. Out of 41 planes, only 6 returned. But those sacrifices kept the Japanese distracted and their decks cluttered. Then, at 10:20 a.m., the sky split open. From 20,000 feet, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown plunged through the clouds. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into floating infernos. Fuel lines erupted, ammunition cooked off, and the air filled with black pillars of smoke visible for miles. Admiral Nagumo's carefully planned assault disintegrated before his eyes. Hypo's decoding team, still listening to open frequencies, intercepted fragmented distress calls. Japanese operators screamed for assistance, their disciplined Morse breaking into chaos. Rochefort removed his headset slowly. "That's it," he murmured. "They're finished." But the battle wasn't yet over. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch a counterstrike that hit Yorktown twice, forcing her abandonment. Even so, American scouts soon located Hiryu, and by sunset, she too was burning. In a single day, Japan lost 4 of its best carriers, over 250 planes, and many of its most experienced pilots, a loss it would never recover from. When the smoke cleared, Midway stood as a victory not only of courage, but of information. Nimitz summarized it plainly. The intelligence available was of the highest order and proved of inestimable value. In truth, it had saved the Pacific Fleet. The success shocked even Washington. Officers at OP-20G, long skeptical of Rochefort, struggled to believe that his ragtag basement crew had outguessed the entire Imperial Navy. One memo called it a miracle of deduction. But inside Hypo, no one used the word miracle. It had been mathematics, intuition, and sheer endurance. Every decrypted group, every educated guess, had built a bridge from uncertainty to foresight. For the men of Hypo, the explosions at Midway were not heard as thunder, but as confirmation that numbers could change history. After the victory, Rochefort was summoned to Washington for debriefing. He arrived exhausted, expecting gratitude. Instead, bureaucratic jealousy awaited him. Rivals claimed his success had been exaggerated, that the breakthrough was theirs. Rochefort, ever blunt, refused to play politics. Within months, he was reassigned to a desk job, removed from the very code war he had won. He accepted the demotion without protest. The work mattered, he told a friend, not who got the credit. It would take decades for the Navy to recognize his role officially. In 1986, long after his death, Rochefort finally received the Distinguished Service Medal. Yet his victory endured in the silence of every intercepted signal that followed. From Midway onward, U.S. cryptanalysts, the successors of Hypo, would read Japanese messages faster than Tokyo could send them.
Convoys were routed, ambushes avoided, and entire battles won before the first shot was fired. Back in 1942, as reports of Midway reached the American public, few could imagine that behind the triumph stood a man in a bathrobe surrounded by stacks of code sheets and half-drained coffee cups.
The headlines spoke of pilots and admirals, not of analysts and interceptors. But the truth was simple. America had won because one radio man refused to believe a code was unbreakable. And somewhere in the depths of Pearl Harbor, beneath the hum of the radio sets, Joseph Rochefort allowed himself one brief smile. The victory at Midway was not just a battle won, it was a door opened. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States could see the shape of the enemy's plans before they unfolded. But inside the shadowy rooms of America's listening posts, another, quieter war had only begun. One fought through airwaves, memory, and the fragile rhythm of Morse code. After Midway, the cryptoanalytic network exploded in size. The Navy expanded its intercept stations across the Pacific, from Hawaii to Australia, from Guam to the Aleutians. Each one had the same mission: catch every Japanese signal, no matter how faint. They called it traffic analysis, not reading the messages, but studying how they moved. When did Tokyo send orders? How long did it take for ships to reply? Which call signs went silent before an operation? Each pattern told a story. The raw intercepts flooded into the code-breaking centers known as Hypo, CAST, and Frummel, and from there to Washington's Central Cryptologic Division, OP-20G. Together, these rooms formed the nervous system of America's Pacific intelligence. And at their heart stood one of the most ambitious secret projects of the war: magic. Magic was more than a code. It was the coordinated effort to decrypt all high-level Japanese communications, military, diplomatic, and naval. Its roots stretched back before the war, when U.S. Army cryptologists had broken Japan's diplomatic cipher, nicknamed Purple. That success had given Washington insights into Japanese negotiations. But after Midway, magic became something greater: a real-time intelligence weapon. Each night, teams of analysts worked by lamplight, decoding telegrams sent by Tokyo's Foreign Office and the Imperial Navy. Their work combined mathematics and intuition, machinery and human endurance. Most of the machinery was primitive by later standards: banks of electromechanical IBM punch card sorters, typewriters modified for cryptographic transposition, and reams of log paper. But the system worked. Magic summaries, printed on thin onion skin sheets, were hand-carried to President Roosevelt and key commanders every morning. The data was so sensitive that even top admirals were forbidden to keep copies. The codebreakers' world was one of total secrecy. They were sworn never to speak of their work, not even to each other outside the office. Families thought they were simple clerks. The truth, that they were guiding fleets and armies through a global war, would remain buried for decades. Among them were hundreds of women cryptanalysts, drawn from universities, teaching jobs, and even music conservatories. They were meticulous, tireless, and astonishingly effective. At a time when the military still doubted women's roles in combat, they became the unseen force that shaped victory. Women like Agnes Driscoll, known as Miss Aggie, had already cracked Japanese naval ciphers before the war. Others, such as Genevieve Grotchen, had been instrumental in breaking the Purple Code. Their names would be forgotten by history, but their impact was immense. Working side by side with Navy operators, these women monitored signal strengths, transcribed endless streams of 5-digit groups, and caught the faintest nuances of transmission patterns. One recalled, "We began to recognize certain operators just by the rhythm of their tapping. We called it their fist." To outsiders, it looked like chaos: papers stacked to the ceiling, operators chain-smoking, the clatter of typewriters, and the buzz of headphones. But in reality, it was a symphony of order. Every note, every tone, every blip of radio noise had meaning. By late 1942, the cryptologic war was shaping every front of the Pacific campaign. The Japanese army still believed its communications were secure. But thanks to magic and the surviving fragments of JM-25, American commanders often knew their intentions days in advance. In the Solomon Islands, during the brutal campaign for Guadalcanal, intercepts revealed troop reinforcements heading toward the island on what the Japanese called the Tokyo Express, nightly destroyer runs under darkness. Armed with this information, Admiral William Halsey set traps that shredded entire convoys. At the same time, Navy intercept stations picked up communications between Rabaul and Truk, indicating preparations for airstrikes. These decrypts allowed Marine pilots to scramble before enemy bombers arrived, turning what could have been surprise attacks into ambushes. Each success came from signals borne hundreds of miles away, bounced off clouds and ionospheres, caught by patient ears. It was the first true information-driven war. Inside Hypo, the atmosphere had changed since Midway. Rochefort's old office now buzzed with new recruits, mathematicians, linguists, radio engineers. The walls were lined with frequency maps and charts of Japanese call signs. Every time the enemy changed their encryption tables, the Americans adapted faster. Even so, the work remained dangerous in its own way. A single mistake could cost lives, misidentifying a convoy, mistranslating a time, or leaking a clue that the codes were compromised. If the Japanese ever suspected how deeply they had been penetrated, they could have changed everything. To preserve secrecy, decrypted information was disguised in field reports under vague attributions: reliable intelligence, scout plane sighting, intercepted communications. Only a few senior officers knew the truth. The price of knowing too much was silence. By 1943, the Code War had entered a new phase. The Americans were no longer merely intercepting, they were predicting. At the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, decrypts revealed the schedule of a major Japanese troop convoy from Rabaul to Leh. Allied bombers struck at exactly the right moment, annihilating 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Over 3,000 enemy soldiers were lost before they could even reach the shore. It was another invisible triumph for the codebreakers. But their success carried an ethical weight. Each decoded message described lives, ships, names, missions. They saw death before it happened, knew where men would die, and could do nothing except mark it in ink. As one analyst later said, "We lived with ghosts we created." The Japanese, unaware of the leaks, continued to trust their ciphers. Yet beneath that confidence, small signs of suspicion began to appear. Analysts in Tokyo noticed American ships appearing at just the right place too often. New encryption overlays were introduced, but each change only slowed, not stopped the Americans. The codebreakers adapted, again and again. In the final months of 1943, a different kind of message reached Hypo. A transmission concerning a high-ranking Japanese officer touring the front lines, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor himself. Using the broken JN-25 system, U.S. intelligence pinpointed his flight schedule almost to the minute. The information reached Admiral Halsey, who authorized Operation Vengeance, a deadly interception over the jungles of Bougainville. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters shot down Yamamoto's plane. The mastermind of Japan's naval strategy died instantly. It was one of the most precise assassinations in history, planned not by spies or saboteurs, but by cryptographers with pencils and radios. The Japanese never knew how their enemy found him. The Americans simply said it was a lucky guess. As 1944 approached, the balance of the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. The U.S. Navy, guided by decrypts and reconnaissance, was advancing across the Central Pacific. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Leyte. Every landing, every strike was shaped by the invisible hand of the codebreakers. The enemy still transmitted in confidence, unaware that their every move was being heard, dissected, and mapped. In the words of one officer, "We were reading their mail faster than they could deliver it." But for those working in the dim basements of Pearl Harbor and Washington, victory was bittersweet. They could never tell their story, never claimed their credit. Their triumphs would remain buried beneath classification stamps for 40 years. Still, each night, as they left the decoding rooms and stepped into the tropical darkness, they knew something few others did: that knowledge had become the most powerful weapon of war. By 1944, Japan's empire stretched thin. Thousands of miles of occupied islands, bleeding supply lines, and a navy still proud but dying. Yet on paper, Tokyo's high command refused to surrender. They believed their codes were still unbroken, their communications still hidden behind the fortress of numbers. They were wrong. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the American codebreakers, those same men and women who had labored in secret since before Midway, were now reading entire Japanese messages in near real time. Every dispatch, every logistical order, every casualty report passed through the invisible hands of the cryptologic corps. The Americans no longer fought blindly. They knew where convoys would sail, which airfields were being built, and how many troops guarded each island. Even before boots hit the beaches, the enemy's defense plans were already in American hands. This was not luck. It was the culmination of years of work, of pencils worn down to nubs, of sleepless nights in rooms lit by radio glow. The silent war of signals had reached its zenith. In early 1944, the network of intercept stations had grown into an empire of its own. Dozens of listening posts now dotted the Pacific, in Australia, the Philippines, the Aleutians, and even tiny atolls that few maps named. They formed a web around Japan's communications, catching transmissions the moment they left the airwaves. At the center sat Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, the evolved successor of Rochefort's old hypo station. Its mission? Coordinate the avalanche of intercepted messages from every Allied base and feed them into one vast intelligence picture. Each morning, decrypted traffic was compiled into a report known as the Daily Summary. It detailed every detected Japanese ship, every intercepted pilot code, every new cipher indicator. Copies went directly to Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur. They were the war's invisible map. This system would guide the Allied advance through 1944, across the Marianas, through the Philippines, and toward Okinawa. Wherever the Japanese tried to regroup, their words betrayed them. When American forces landed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history erupted. For the Japanese, it was a desperate attempt to crush the invasion fleet and save the Philippines. For the Americans, it was a test of how perfectly intelligence could choreograph a battle. Before the first shot, U.S. cryptanalysts had already decrypted Japan's orders. They knew Admiral Kurita's Central Force would slip through the San Bernardino Strait. They knew where Admiral Ozawa's carrier decoy force would operate to lure Halsey north. They even knew the composition of the Southern Fleet, its ships, its timing, its commander. This information allowed Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet and Admiral Spruance's carriers to position perfectly. The result was chaos for the Japanese: 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships destroyed, and nearly the entire surface fleet shattered. Once again, the invisible war had decided the visible one. Yet behind every triumph there was unease. The deeper the codebreakers reached into the enemy's secrets, the more they confronted a moral paradox. Victory built on listening to the doomed. Intercepted Japanese army reports described starvation on isolated islands, desperate pleas for supplies, commanders urging their men to die with honor. The analysts read them all. They knew who would die before anyone else did. One operator later wrote, "We could hear them dying in slow motion, not through sound, but through silence." As the Americans closed in on Okinawa in 1945, decrypts painted a grim picture. Japan was training civilians for suicide defense, converting schools into arsenals, preparing kamikaze pilots by the thousands. There was no mystery left, only inevitability. In the spring of 1945, the Japanese communication systems began collapsing under bombardment, but the decrypts kept coming.
One of them, a diplomatic message from Tokyo to its embassy in Moscow, revealed Japan's desperate attempt to negotiate peace through the Soviet Union. It was the first clear sign that Tokyo was breaking.
The intelligence reached President Truman during the Potsdam Conference, influencing his fateful decision to demand unconditional surrender, and soon after to authorize the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war that had begun with a radio message over Pearl Harbor was now ending with a code intercepted half a world away. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the codebreakers' rooms fell quiet for the first time in years. The radios went silent. The walls, once plastered with call signs and frequency charts, were stripped bare. Operators packed up their notes and typewriters and walked out into the daylight as anonymous as when they'd arrived. No parades awaited them. Their names appeared in no newspapers. The heroes of this war would remain ghosts for decades, bound by oaths of secrecy and the simple truth that no one could ever know what they'd done. Even Rochefort, whose intuition had changed the course of history at Midway, was long dead by the time the Navy finally acknowledged his contribution. His medal, awarded posthumously, bore a single line that summed up his life: "For distinguished service in breaking the enemy's naval codes." Nothing more, nothing less. But the story did not end there. In the ashes of the Pacific War, a new kind of conflict was already forming, one without front lines, fought in whispers and transmissions. The techniques born at Station Hypo would evolve into the National Security Agency, the global nerve center of American intelligence. Many of the wartime codebreakers, men and women alike, stayed in the shadows, building the post-war cryptologic world. Their successors would uncover Soviet espionage through the Venona project, decrypt Cold War ciphers, and lay the foundations of modern cybersecurity. The tools changed, from radios to satellites, from typewriters to computers, but the principle remained the same. Every enemy leaves a trace, and every war begins with a signal. In 1975, when portions of the Magic and Hypo archives were finally declassified, historians were stunned. The paper trail revealed that nearly every major U.S. victory in the Pacific had depended on radio intelligence. From Midway to Leyte to Okinawa, the pattern was undeniable. It was not luck. It was logic, patience, and the relentless faith of those who believed that truth could be found in noise. Today, few remember the names of the codebreakers who fought this hidden war, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in every intercepted message, every decoded line, every silence broken. They proved that even in the age of steel and fire, knowledge was the sharpest weapon of all. Epilogue. In the quiet corridors of the old Pearl Harbor headquarters, the basement where Station Hypo once stood still exists. The machines are gone, but the walls remain. Visitors describe a strange feeling there, as if the air itself remembers the hum of the radios and the scratching of pencils. On a faded wall near where Rochefort's desk once sat, someone had etched 3 words before leaving in 1945. Silence won wars. And perhaps it did. Because long before the bombers flew, before the carriers clashed, before flags changed hands, victory began not with a battle, but with one radio man who refused to stop listening.